Hi, my name is Nicole Lehner, and I'm going to be talking about my thesis that I am working on currently on police officer knowledge and perceptions of use of force under the Fourth Amendment and the emotional labor theory. I'm working on this with my thesis committee, Dr. Totten, Dr. Lee, and Dr. Stringer. As we learned in our reading, a thesis, when you're writing it, you need a committee. And on this committee are people that have different ideas or different backgrounds that can help your writing go into different directions. For my thesis, Dr. Totten has got a legal background, so he has helped me with the Fourth Amendment right and unreasonable search to seizure. Dr. Lee has got a background in statistics, and Dr. Stringer has got a background in statistics as well as in policing. When I was trying to figure out what I wanted to write about, I was really interested in the use of force, especially with the cases that have really happened in the media recently, especially where people have lost their lives, like Breonna Taylor. And I wanted to understand if police officers know what the rights are of individuals when they're using lethal force. And I wanted to understand more on what kind of knowledge that they have in this area. So I used Dr. Totten's legal background and expanded my knowledge on the Fourth Amendment's unreasonable search and seizure laws, and then cultivated the topic on their knowledge and perceptions on use of force under the Fourth Amendment rule. I also have a background in sociology, and I have been looking towards going to get my PhD in sociology or criminal justice. I haven't quite decided yet. But with the emotional labor theory, that's actually a sociological theory. And I wanted to include this so that if I did apply for a PhD program in sociology, that I would have some background on my thesis that would be relevant to that topic area. So I wanted to converge this topic because there really hasn't been that much literature that is done before. I found one article that had converged use of force with the emotional labor theory, but it didn't take first-hand data from surveys. They actually took data that was secondary and used that with the emotional labor theory and kind of expanded on that. So the emotional labor theory pretty much is developed by Arlie Hochschild, which we'll go into a little bit more when I go through the lit review. But it was developed to assess the emotional labor of flight attendants and how they had to uphold this persona regardless of them being yelled at by people or the demands that are being placed on them, and they have to maintain this. And so I wanted to apply this towards the role of policing and see what kind of interactions they have with use of force and how it plays into it. When I was doing research, I had to have different areas that I was going to be researching and to put in my lit review. And case law was one of the big parts. We have to understand that the Fourth Amendment rule comes from case law that is passed down from the Supreme Court justices of the United States. And Tennessee v. Garner, Graham v. Connor, Scott v. Harris, and Plumhoff v. Rickard, are all different cases that kind of developed the case law around the Fourth Amendment rule. Each one has their own pieces of knowledge that they grant. Each one kind of builds off of each other. Like Tennessee v. Garner and Graham v. Connor, those ones kind of develop the whole lethal use of force and when officers can utilize it and what's the rulings behind it. And Scott v. Harris and Plumhoff v. Rickard kind of expanded on utilizing objects towards the use of force, like police vehicles. So understanding that case law and what is allowed under the case law was really important to know when going through and developing the information and the literature review for this topic. Now, some additional literature was the history of policing, and in the master's level program, you take a course called policing or advanced policing, and we kind of went through all the eras of policing from the beginning all the way up to now. So I included that in my policing aspect of my paper because it was really important to understand this and how the development of policing and what their roles are and what their requirements were. And then I included some areas of fixing the problem because utilizing use of force, there's a lot of different things that people could do to avert from using the force, such as utilizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or additional training on dealing with people with mental health disorders and or other types of substance abuse or substance usage. So if people knew how to handle people, they might not utilize lethal use of force as much. Now, additionally, I wanted to talk a little bit about the President's Task Force on the 21st Century Policing, because that kind of added to what police officers are supposed to do and the roles and rules behind policing, and kind of going into depth a little bit more on that. And then procedural justice and social interaction is training. And procedural justice is pretty much the interactions between the public and the policing, and or the police that police them, and how that interaction is supposed to work, and how the unity between the two should be, and how to build upon that. And then lastly, the limitations of the research and where are we going to go from here? What can we do to help bring about more information to this topic area that wasn't already discussed in a lot of these different articles? Now, lastly, the emotional labor theory. Arlie Hochschild, as I previously said, wrote a book called The Managed Heart. And in The Managed Heart, she explained two different types of acting, or the exposure or people's feelings or their displayed feelings that they have whenever they are interacting with others. So her article, like we had talked, or her writing that we talked about, was about flight attendants and the role of a flight attendant and what they are supposed to do: smile, dress a certain way, act a certain way, do certain things. And the deep acting and the surface acting explain I guess you can explain it as the conflict that that individual has with their internal self when they are expressing their feelings, whether this is surface acting, which is they are just acting the way that they need to act, even though internally they don't want to feel this way, or deep acting, where they are starting to feel the feelings that they don't want to be feeling, but because they've been doing it so long or for such long persistence amount of time, or to the level that they are, that they start feeling those feelings even though mentally they don't want to. Now, how does this apply to policing? Well, police officers are one of those areas that they too can feel different things other than what they should be feeling. Like, as a police officer, you can't do certain things, like if you're being called names or you're being harassed or other things. Like, you can do what's based off the law by if an individual is acting a fool and they're supposed to be giving you information, then you can do obstruction. But if they need to be in control of their feelings and they have to display feelings that are required of them as a police officer and as the department sees what they're supposed to feel. So I wanted to look in a little bit more on this emotional labor theory as it applies to policing. Now, once I got all of my literature review done and I started developing my survey, I had to get IRB approval. And in doing so, I had to create a consent cover letter, which pretty much says these are the different aspects of the survey, how long it's going to take, what are the benefits of it, that their participation is completely voluntary, that there will be confidentiality, that I won't be able to disclose who is taking the survey, what the project's about, and just kind of inviting people to take part in the survey. Now, because my thesis has got some emotional portions to it, which might cause some emotional distress towards individuals, I had to do additional training on no harm to human subjects. From there, I would submit my survey, a letter from a police department stating that they supported my research, and this consent cover letter to IRB for them to go through. Now, they didn't like some of my survey questions, specifically on race and gender and sexuality, and what was the last one that they didn't like? Ethnicity. And so I had to take those out of my survey, which took out a lot of my demographic information. And this was pretty much because it was breaching confidentiality. Like, there's not a lot of females that do policing, so they were afraid that if somebody wrote that they were female, that it would be more likely that we could figure out who exactly submitted to the survey. Same thing with race and ethnicity. There's races of Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Indian, and the majority of police officers are Black and white. So if you had an Asian individual that denoted on his survey or her survey or their survey and stated that they were of that race, that it's more likely that they could be figured out. So they wanted me to delete those things. So I had to submit my cover letter, and like I said, the police letter of support that came from a chief of police, as well as the survey for them to approve for me to be able to disseminate. After I went through the lengthy process of getting IRB approval, I had to develop my hypotheses to figure out what I wanted to test through my survey. And I have 3 hypotheses that I'll be testing in my thesis. One is officers with more time in service will have more knowledge on the topic of use of force. So pretty much my dependent variable is time in service of the officer, and my independent variable is the knowledge of use of force. So I would compare those two and contrast those two and put them through the rigor of the SPSS to try to figure out if my hypothesis is supported or if it's refuted. Second hypothesis was officers with more knowledge of use of force will have higher levels of emotional labor, with my dependent variable being knowledge of use of force and my independent variable being emotional labor. And then lastly, officers with more time in service will have lower levels of emotional labor. And my dependent variable was time in service, and my independent variable was emotional labor. Now here's for the fun part. I'm going to show you my survey. Now don't get overwhelmed because the survey has a couple different pieces to it, and I'll explain that when I'm going through it. But my survey was self-administered, and as we read in our books, self-administered was usually done by mail-in. However, I included this survey with a self-sealing envelope so that as people completed the survey, they could put it in my box or deliver it to me, and it would be sealed so I wouldn't know who was associated with which survey. Ta-da! So here's my survey in pages 1 and 2. And as you'll see, there's different sections. Scenario-based questions were of my first section. And what they were different scenarios where a police officer was engaged with an individual and whether or not their actions were upheld by Fourth Amendment rule. And my answers, or the choices that the individuals had, was on a Likert scale of strongly agree, disagree, and strongly disagree. So they were mutually exclusive. And then on section 2, I had different options, as including others, so that would give them an option that if whatever I had suggested in the list, if they didn't include all of them, there was an option for there to be other, and they could add it in. And these were also knowledge on Fourth Amendment rule and reasonable search and seizure and what officers should know. And then there's some knowledge on case law. So this is just 2 of the 4 pages that it was included in my survey. And here's pages 3 and 4. You'll see that there's a ratio variable that I had, which how many times on an annual basis do you engage in use of force on average? Because 0 could be an answer, it was considered a ratio variable. And then you have the ordinal variable, which were my section 4, which were for my emotional labor piece, which was also a Likert scale. And then I have a nominal variable, which is what is your rank, which was patrol 1 through deputy chief and chief. So this was my survey that I handed out to individuals to have them fill out. I'm surprised that they didn't want me to take out rank. And when I say they, I mean IRB, because there's not that many chiefs and deputy chiefs in the departments. And so if they put that as down as a selection, then there would be more likelihood that I could figure out who did what. But I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the data itself and what does it say. And the survey is what gathers that data. So when I disseminated the survey, I emailed police departments to get approval after I had gotten IRB approval, and I reached out to 7 different departments, and only 3 allowed me to survey their police officers, one of which actually asked me to cease and desist pretty much and to stop handing out surveys to their departments until I got approval from their deputy chief. That deputy chief would not respond to my emails or my phone calls, so unfortunately I only gathered data from 1 day worth of collection, and I utilized that data because it's my data, and without it, I wouldn't have a lot of information to provide to SPSS to get out the data that I needed. So as you'll see, I only collected 65 total surveys. And if I would have done surveys on the computer, I probably would have gotten even less because on all of these, one department I knew a lot of people from, so they were more inclined to fill out my survey. The other department, I stood in front of the people and expressed my need for gathering this data, and a lot of them filled it out. And the same with the third department. I went to their shift call meetings and had them fill that out. And additionally, I did include self-sealing envelopes for their confidentiality. But as you can see in the pie graph, that was the breakdown of all 65 surveys based off Department 1, Department 2, and Department 3. Now, when I was putting the information into SPSS, I had to create a code book on how each variable would be entered to SPSS and which variable would be on which line. And then I went through and made sure that the variables were added to SPSS and input the data. And I double checked to make sure that everything was accurate because I was going through 65 surveys with over 20 some odd questions. Then I had to clean the data and start running my analysis. And here's where it got a little tricky because my knowledge on use of force was spanned over a couple of different questions. I had to merge them together. And as you'll see here, the knowledge on use of force, the frequency and percent, the higher the number meant that there was more knowledge on case law. So as you can see, on the 8, 30 of them stated that they had a lot of knowledge. And so that was 46.2% of all my respondents. And as I got down lower, you can see, like the lower the number, the lower percentage. So majority of them really knew the case law. As you can see here, the emotional labor also had a scale, and I had to come up with converging a couple of different variables in order to get this information. As you can see here, the score of 13 and below shows extreme amounts of emotional labor because the lower the number, the higher the emotional labor, and the higher the number, the lower the emotional labor. So it's almost inverted from what you would think. And as you can see right in the middle, which people either agreed or disagreed, there was a big population there that kind of fell in the middle. So they didn't quite have a strong amount of emotional labor, or they didn't quite have a weak amount of emotional labor. They just had emotional labor. So this was just some of the frequencies that I did on my statistics, and the rest is yet to come.